The blood-red sun dipped below the jagged horizon as Pearl Richardson pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, unable to shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from the encroaching darkness of Silver Creek. The small mining town was barely a speck on the Colorado Territory map of 1873, but to Pearl, it represented both escape and possibility, something she desperately needed after fleeing her uncle's suffocating home in Boston. Miss Richardson. "We're closing up now," called Mr. Holloway, the elderly shopkeeper who had kindly allowed her to stay past closing time to finish reviewing the ledgers for her new position as the town's schoolteacher. "Of course, I've lost track of the hour," Pearl replied, gathering her papers with slender fingers. At 22, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced more hardships than her years suggested. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet, though a few rebellious strands had escaped during her hours of concentration. Mr. Holloway smiled kindly. "It's not safe for a lady to walk alone after dark. Perhaps I could escort you to the boarding house." Pearl shook her head. "Thank you, but it's just 3 blocks away. I wouldn't want to delay your supper with Mrs. Holloway." The old man frowned but didn't press the matter. "Very well, but hurry along. Some of those miners who struck out are drowning their sorrows at the Silver Dollar tonight." Pearl nodded her understanding and stepped out into the cool evening air. Silver Creek had seemed like Providence when she'd answered the advertisement for a schoolteacher. Remote enough to keep her past behind her, yet civilized enough to offer respectable employment for a young woman alone in the world, she walked briskly down the main street, passing the saloon where raucous laughter and piano music spilled into the night. The boarding house run by the stern but fair Mrs. Whittaker was just beyond the next corner, and Pearl quickened her pace as darkness settled more firmly over the town. From the shadows between 2 buildings, a voice slurred, "Well, look what we got here." Pearl froze as 3 men stepped into her path. Their unsteady gait and the smell of whiskey told her everything she needed to know. "Pardon me, gentlemen," she said firmly, trying to step around them. The largest of the 3 moved to block her way. "Ain't you the new schoolmarm?" "Too fine for the likes of us ordinary folk, I'll bet." "I assure you I harbor no such pretensions," Pearl replied, working to keep her voice steady. "Now, if you'll excuse me, you ain't going nowhere just yet," the man sneered, reaching for her arm. Pearl stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the street had emptied. There would be no assistance from passing strangers. "Leave the lady be, Mercer." The commanding voice came from behind her. Pearl turned slightly to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows. Even in the dimness, she could make out his broad shoulders and the distinctive silhouette of a cowboy hat. "Mind your business, Xander," the man called Mercer spat. "This don't concern you." "A lady being harassed concerns any decent man," the stranger replied, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. As he stepped closer, Pearl could see him more clearly. Dusty boots, worn denim, a faded blue shirt beneath a leather vest. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "You always were too high and mighty," Mercer growled. "Just because you ride for the rocking Y don't make you better than us." The cowboy Xander stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Pearl. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away. Take it." Mercer's face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, but Xander was quicker. With practiced efficiency, he sidestepped and delivered a precise blow to Mercer's midsection that doubled the larger man over. One of Mercer's companions pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the faint light from a nearby window. "You shouldn't have done that," Pearl gasped as the man lunged. Xander pushed her behind him with one arm while blocking the knife with his other. There was a brief struggle, followed by the sound of knuckles connecting with flesh. The knife wielder stumbled back, clutching his jaw. The third man seemed to reconsider his options and backed away, pulling at Mercer's sleeve. "Come on, it ain't worth it. That's Xander Young, he's friends with the sheriff." Mercer, still hunched over, gave Xander a venomous glare. "This ain't finished. It is for tonight," Xander replied evenly. The 3 men retreated, disappearing back into the alley from which they'd emerged. Only when they were gone did Xander turn to Pearl, his expression softening with concern. "Are you hurt, madam?" Pearl shook her head, trying to regain her composure. "No, thanks to your timely intervention, Mr. Young." His mouth quirked into a slight smile. "Xander, please, and you must be Miss Richardson, the new teacher everyone's been talking about." Pearl felt a flush creep up her neck. Word travels fast in a small town, I suppose. That it does. He glanced down the street. "May I escort you the rest of the way to your destination? Mercer and his friends might be drunk enough to try their luck again." Pearl hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I would appreciate that. I'm staying at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house." They walked side by side, Pearl acutely aware of the tall, solid presence beside her. His stride was deliberately shortened to match hers, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile. "How long have you been in Silver Creek?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "About 4 years. I work as foreman at the Rocking Y Ranch just outside of town, and before that," a shadow crossed his face. "A bit of everywhere, fought in the war, drifted for a while after." The mention of the war, still a raw wound in the nation's psyche, even 8 years after its conclusion, made Pearl curious about which side he'd fought for, but she knew better than to ask. Many men in the West had come to escape their pasts, just as she had. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story building with a small porch and neatly painted shutters. Light glowed warmly from the downstairs windows. "Thank you again, Mr. Young." Xander, Pearl said, turning to face him. "My pleasure, Miss Richardson." "Pearl," she offered with a small smile. In the lamplight from the porch, she could finally see his eyes, a striking shade of green that reminded her of summer foliage. There was a kindness there, but also something guarded, as if he too carried secrets. "Well then, Pearl," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Welcome to Silver Creek. It's not always as unwelcoming as tonight might suggest." "I should hope not, or my teaching position may be shorter than anticipated," she replied with a touch of humor. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Most folks here are decent. They've just had a hard time of it with the mine yields dropping, but they value education for their children, which is why they scraped together enough to hire you." Pearl felt a renewed sense of purpose at his words. "Then I shall endeavor not to disappoint them." "I doubt you could." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper, causing a curious flutter in her chest. "Good night, Miss Pearl." "Good night, Xander." She watched as he turned and walked back toward the main street, his tall figure gradually blending with the shadows. Only when he had disappeared entirely did she turn and enter the boarding house, where Mrs. Whittaker's questions about her escort waited. That night, as Pearl lay in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy with the green eyes who had appeared just when she needed him. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Pearl dressed carefully for her first day of teaching in a simple blue dress with a white collar, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest cap. The schoolhouse was a single-room building at the edge of town, freshly whitewashed for the new teacher's arrival. As Pearl approached, she saw a group of children of various ages already gathered outside, their faces alight with curiosity about the newcomer who would be their teacher. Among the children stood several parents, equally interested in sizing up the young woman entrusted with their offspring's education. Miss Richardson, a woman with a weathered face and kind eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Martha Wilson. My husband's on the town council. We're so pleased you've come." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Wilson," Pearl replied, shaking the offered hand. "These are my twins, Sarah and Samuel," Mrs. Wilson continued, gesturing to 2 identical 10-year-olds with matching freckles. "And most of the other children are here too, 26 in all, ages 6 to 16. Pearl surveyed the group, noting the mix of carefully dressed children from in-town families and those in rougher clothing who clearly came from outlying farms and ranches. All would receive the same education under her care, regardless of their circumstances. "Well then," Pearl said, raising her voice slightly to address the gathered crowd, "shall we begin our first day of learning?" The morning passed in a flurry of introductions, assessments of reading levels, and establishing classroom rules. By the time the noon bell rang, Pearl had a clearer picture of the educational needs facing her. Some of the older boys had only sporadic schooling, while a few of the younger children were surprisingly advanced thanks to educated mothers. As the children scattered for their midday meal, Pearl sat at her desk reviewing her notes. A shadow fell across her papers, and she looked up to find Xander Young standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Young," she said, surprised, "what brings you to the schoolhouse?" He stepped inside, his tall frame seeming to make the room smaller. "I was in town for supplies and thought I'd see how your first day was progressing." Pearl felt a smile tugging at her lips. "Very well, thank you. The children seem eager to learn. They're good kids, mostly." He glanced around the room, taking in the worn desks and limited supplies. The town's been saving for proper books. The last teacher may do with just a few shared readers and slates. "We'll manage," Pearl assured him. "I brought some books from my personal collection that can be shared." Xander nodded, then seemed to remember something. "Actually, there was another reason for my visit. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned you were asking about transportation to visit some of the outlying families." "Yes," Pearl confirmed. "I want to meet the parents who couldn't come today and perhaps encourage enrollment for children who aren't attending." "That's commendable," he said, "but not all the trails are safe for a woman traveling alone. I've spoken with my employer, Mr. Yates. He's offered the use of a wagon and driver when you need to make these visits." Pearl's pride bristled slightly. "While I appreciate the concern, Mr. Young, I'm quite capable. I don't doubt your capabilities," he interrupted gently, "but there are practical considerations. The terrain can be treacherous and some homesteads are miles apart. A woman alone might be seen as vulnerable." Pearl wanted to argue but knew he was right. She was still learning the realities of Western life. "Very well. Please convey my thanks to Mr. Yates. I could take you myself this Saturday if you'd like to start with the families closest to town," Xander offered, his expression carefully neutral. Pearl studied him, trying to discern his motives. Was this merely frontier courtesy or something more? Either way, she did need the assistance. "That would be most helpful, thank you." A brief smile crossed his face. "I'll come by the boarding house at 9 then." The afternoon session of school was just beginning as children filed back in. Xander donned his hat and nodded to Pearl. "I'll let you get back to your teaching, Miss Richardson." "Until Saturday, Mr. Young." As he left, several of the older girls giggled and whispered behind their hands. Pearl cleared her throat meaningfully, and they quickly took their seats, though the knowing glances they exchanged told her that her interaction with the handsome cowboy would be the subject of girlish speculation. Throughout the rest of the week, Pearl threw herself into establishing routines and getting to know her students. Silver Creek began to feel less foreign as she learned the rhythms of the town: the morning bustle at the general store, the midday quiet when men were working, the evening socializing at the church or, for the less devout, the saloon. She encountered Xander only once more before Saturday, a brief exchange of greetings as she left the general store, and he rode through town on ranch business. Yet she found her thoughts drifting to him more often than was sensible for a woman who prided herself on her practical nature. Saturday arrived with a splash of autumn color painting the surrounding hillsides. Pearl dressed in her most practical outfit, a sturdy dark skirt and jacket over a simple blouse, with sturdy boots suitable for country visiting. She was just fastening a small brooch at her collar when Mrs. Whittaker knocked at her door. "Your cowboy's here," the older woman said with a knowing twinkle in her eye. "And my, doesn't he clean up nicely?" "He's not my cowboy," Pearl corrected automatically, though she couldn't help but hurry to the window for a glimpse. Xander stood beside a well-maintained wagon, his usual trail dust absent. He'd exchanged his working clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore the practical denim trousers of a working man. His dark hair was damp and combed, and he'd trimmed his stubble to a neat shadow along his jaw. Pearl collected her satchel of books and papers and made her way downstairs, working to compose her expression into one of professional appreciation rather than the flutter of anticipation she actually felt. "Good morning," she greeted him as she stepped onto the porch. Xander tipped his hat, his green eyes warming. Morning, Miss Richardson. Ready for your rounds. Indeed. I've prepared a list of families I'd like to visit, she said, pulling a small notebook from her satchel. He helped her into the wagon with a steady hand, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horse, a sturdy bay, set off at a brisk pace, and soon they were leaving the town behind. I thought we'd visit the Hendersons first, Xander said as they traveled. They've got 3 children of school age, but they're 5 miles out, and they've been keeping the kids home to help with the harvest, Pearl nodded. Mr. Henderson mentioned they'd be sending the children next week. I wanted to bring them some materials to prepare. The conversation flowed easily as they traveled, discussing the families they would visit and the challenges of education in such a remote area. Pearl found herself charmed by Xander's knowledge of the community and his genuine concern for its welfare. How did you come to be in Silver Creek? He asked as the wagon climbed a gentle slope. It's not exactly on the main routes west. Pearl hesitated, deciding how much to reveal. I saw the advertisement for a teacher in a Denver newspaper. I had been teaching at a small ladies' academy in Boston but wanted a change of scenery. Xander glanced at her, clearly sensing there was more to the story but didn't press. Boston to Silver Creek is quite a change. Do you miss the city? Some aspects, she admitted. The libraries, concerts, certain conveniences, but there's something honest about this place. People may have less, but they seem to value what matters more, he nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's why I stayed. After the war, I drifted for a while, looking for somewhere that made sense. The Rocking Y offered that honest work. Good people. No one asking too many questions about the past. Their first visit to the Henderson farm went smoothly, with Pearl charming the initially reluctant parents and engaging the shy children with promises of exciting lessons to come. At each subsequent homestead, Pearl noticed how Xander's presence seemed to ease her introduction. The men respected him, and the women trusted his judgment. By mid-afternoon, they had visited 5 families and were heading toward their final stop, a small cabin where a widow named Mrs. Collins lived with her daughter and son. As they approached, Xander's expression grew troubled. Something's not right, he murmured, pulling the wagon to a halt some distance from the cabin. No smoke from the chimney and the doors open. Pearl followed his gaze, concern rising. Perhaps they're out working, maybe, but he didn't sound convinced. Wait here. Before Pearl could protest, he jumped down from the wagon and approached the cabin cautiously, one hand resting near his hip where she noticed for the first time he carried a holstered revolver. He disappeared inside the small dwelling, emerging moments later with a grim expression. They're gone. Looks like they left in a hurry, food still on the table, clothes missing from the pegs. Pearl frowned. Where would they go, Mrs. Collins was planning to enroll her children next month after the harvest. Xander scanned the surrounding area, his eyes narrowed. I don't like this. The Collins place borders Blackwater Canyon. There've been rumors. What rumors? Pearl pressed when he didn't continue. He sighed. Some of the ranchers have been losing cattle. Tracks leading toward the canyon. A few men have gone missing, 2 prospectors, mostly. You think Mrs. Collins and her children are in danger? I don't know, but we should head back to town and let the sheriff know. He helped Pearl back into the wagon and turned the horse around with efficient movements. I'm sorry your rounds ended on this note. As they traveled back toward Silver Creek, the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped noticeably. Pearl shivered slightly, and without comment, Xander reached behind the seat and produced a worn but clean blanket, which he handed to her. Thank you, she said, wrapping it around her shoulders. Not just for the blanket, but for today. I couldn't have made these visits without your help. He smiled, though his eyes remained vigilant on the trail ahead. It was my pleasure. The children need education, and you're bringing that to them. It's important work. Something in his tone made Pearl curious. Did you have much schooling growing up? A wry expression crossed his face. More than most out here. My father was a doctor before he took up ranching. He made sure I knew my letters and figures, history, and some Latin too, but I learned more from trail dust than books after I turned 16. The war, Pearl guessed softly. He nodded once, his jaw tightening. Union cavalry. I was young and thought I was invincible. Found out different at Shiloh. The personal revelation hung in the air between them, a rare glimpse behind the composed exterior he maintained. Pearl sensed it wasn't a subject he discussed often and felt unexpectedly honored by his trust. "My father died at Antietam," she offered quietly. "He was a professor before the war. My mother never really recovered from the loss." Xander's eyes met hers, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "I'm sorry. As am I for whatever you lost there." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the connection between them deepening without further words needed. As they crested a hill, the town came into view in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled in the valley below. "We should make it back before dark," Xander observed. But as they continued, the wagon suddenly lurched as one wheel struck a deep rut in the trail. Pearl gasped, clutching the seat to keep her balance. Xander steadied her with one arm while controlling the startled horse with the other. "Are you all right?" he asked, his arm lingering around her waist longer than strictly necessary. Pearl nodded, acutely aware of his proximity. "Yes, just startled." He withdrew his arm reluctantly, his eyes holding hers for a moment before returning to the trail. "That wheel didn't sound right. I'd better take a look." He stopped the wagon and jumped down to inspect the damage. Pearl watched as he knelt by the wheel, his capable hands examining the axle and spokes. "The rim's cracked," he announced. "We can continue, but we'll need to go slow and I'll need to keep weight off that side." As he climbed back up, he sat closer to Pearl than before, shifting their combined weight away from the damaged wheel. The increased proximity made Pearl's heart beat a little faster, though she tried to maintain her composure. They proceeded at a slower pace, the wagon creaking ominously with each rotation of the damaged wheel. The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the landscape in dramatic oranges and purples. "It's beautiful," Pearl murmured, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the fiery sky. Xander followed her gaze. "It is. That's another thing that kept me here. Some evenings, when the light hits the mountains just right, it almost seems like a sharp crack split the air, followed instantly by the splintering of wood near Pearl's head." Xander reacted with lightning speed, throwing himself in front of her as a second shot rang out. The horse reared in panic, nearly overturning the wagon. "Get down," Xander commanded, pushing Pearl to the floor of the wagon while simultaneously reaching for his revolver. Pearl's heart hammered in her chest as she realized what was happening. Someone was shooting at them from the gathering darkness. A third shot whistled past, and Xander returned fire, aiming toward a cluster of boulders beside the trail where the shots seemed to be coming from. The horse, terrified by the gunfire, bolted forward, dragging the damaged wagon at a dangerous pace. Xander cursed under his breath, trying to control the panicked animal while keeping Pearl shielded with his body. The wagon bounced violently over the uneven ground, the cracked wheel threatening to give way entirely. "Hold on," he shouted as they careened around a bend in the trail. Another shot rang out in the dark, and Pearl felt Xander's body jerk. He made no sound, but she knew with sickening certainty that he'd been hit. "Xander," she cried, trying to see his face in the fading light. "I'm fine," he gritted out, though the strain in his voice told her otherwise. "Need to. Stop the horse before we wreck." With visible effort, he pulled on the reins, speaking in low, soothing tones to the frightened animal. Gradually, the horse's pace slowed, and Xander guided them off the main trail into a stand of trees that would provide some cover. Only when they were hidden from the trail did he slump slightly, his hand going to his left shoulder where a dark stain was spreading across his shirt. "You're hurt," Pearl said, reaching for him. "Just a graze," he insisted, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "We need to stay quiet." They might be following. Pearl tore a strip from her petticoat, her hands steady despite her fear. "Let me bind it at least." Xander didn't protest as she gently moved his shirt aside to reveal a bleeding wound in his upper arm. The bullet had torn through flesh but hadn't hit bone from what she could tell. Still, the wound was bleeding freely and needed attention. "This will hurt," she warned softly before pressing the cloth firmly against the wound. He inhaled sharply, but made no other sound as she bound his arm as best she could in the dimming light. "Who would be shooting at us?" Pearl whispered as she worked. "Could be the same people who scared off the Collins family," Xander replied, his voice tight with pain. Or just opportunists thinking we'd be easy targets? What do we do now? He scanned their surroundings. We're about 3 miles from town. The wagon won't make it with that wheel, and we don't want to be on the open trail after dark with someone hunting us. There must be somewhere closer we can go for help, Pearl insisted. Xander was silent for a moment, thinking. Old man Carson's cabin is about a mile from here. He's a hermit, but he's decent. If we can make it there on foot, we'd at least have shelter for the night. Can you walk that far? Pearl asked, concern evident in her voice. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I've marched farther with worse, Miss Richardson. He unhitched the horse, deciding it would be better to let the animal go than risk it attracting attention with nervous whinnies. After securing Pearl's satchel and taking a canteen from the wagon, he led her into the deepening shadows of the forest, away from the trail. They moved as quietly as possible, Xander's breathing growing more labored as they progressed. Pearl kept close to his side, ready to offer support if needed, though he stubbornly maintained his pace despite his injury. The forest grew darker, the trees blocking what little twilight remained. Xander navigated by some internal compass, occasionally pausing to listen for sounds of pursuit. Pearl was acutely aware of every snapping twig and rustling leaf, her senses heightened by fear. It's just ahead, Xander whispered after they had been walking for what seemed like hours. Through the trees, Pearl could make out the dim outline of a small cabin. No light showed from its single window, and for a moment she feared it was abandoned. They approached cautiously, Xander signaling for Pearl to stay behind him despite his injury. He knocked softly on the door. Carson, it's Xander Young from the Rocking Y. Silence greeted them. Xander knocked again, more insistently. He might be out hunting, Pearl suggested, her voice hushed. Xander tried the door and found it unlocked. Let's go in. If he returns, we'll explain. The cabin's interior was Spartan but neat, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with preserved foods and supplies. It smelled of wood smoke and tobacco. Looks like he hasn't been gone long, Xander observed, noting the ashes in the fireplace were still warm. He might be back tonight, or he could be on an extended hunting trip. Pearl set her satchel down and immediately turned her attention to Xander. Sit down. I need to properly clean that wound. To her surprise, he complied without argument, sinking onto one of the chairs. His face was alarmingly pale in the dim light, and she could see that the makeshift bandage was soaked through with blood. She found a lantern and matches on the mantel and soon had a soft glow illuminating the cabin. A quick search revealed a basin, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey frontier medicine at its most basic. This will sting, she warned as she carefully removed the blood-soaked cloth from his arm. I've had worse, Xander replied, though he couldn't completely suppress a hiss of pain as she poured whiskey over the wound. Pearl worked methodically, cleaning the injury and binding it with fresh cloth torn from a shirt she found hanging by the fireplace. I apologize to Mr. Carson for the liberty, but necessity dictates. He'd understand, Xander assured her. Carson was a soldier himself, Mexican War. He values practicality over sentiment. When she had finished tending to his wound, Pearl built up the fire from the stacked wood beside the hearth. The growing warmth helped ease the chill that had settled into her bones, though her nerves remained taut. Who do you think was shooting at us? She asked, finally voicing the question that had been burning in her mind. Xander's expression darkened. I have suspicions. There's been talk of a gang operating in these parts, rustling cattle, robbing travelers, intimidating isolated homesteaders. The sheriff's been trying to gather enough evidence to act. And you think they're connected to the Collins family's disappearance? He nodded slowly. It fits the pattern. Isolated family, vulnerable, bordering territory the gang wants to control. Pearl shivered despite the fire's warmth. But why shoot at us? We were asking questions, visiting homesteads. Maybe they thought we were getting too close to something. He paused, looking troubled. Or maybe they recognized me. I've been helping the sheriff quietly gather information. The implications settled heavily between them. They weren't just stranded, they were potentially still in danger. What will we do come morning? Pearl asked. Head back to town as directly as possible, Xander replied. Get word to the sheriff about what happened. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Pearl suddenly became acutely aware of their situation alone in a cabin, miles from town, with night fully descended. In Boston, such a scenario would have meant certain ruin for her reputation. Here in the West, it was simply a matter of survival. As if reading her thoughts, Xander cleared his throat. "You should take the cot, Miss Richardson. I'll keep watch by the fire." "You're injured," she protested. "You need proper rest." "I've slept sitting up more nights than I can count," he insisted. "And someone should stay alert in case our friends from earlier decide to come looking." Pearl wanted to argue but could see the determination in his eyes. "Very well, but promise you'll wake me in a few hours to take a turn." The hint of a smile touched his lips, as the schoolmarm commands. Despite her anxiety, exhaustion soon overtook Pearl. The day's events, the visits, the attack, their flight through the forest had drained her completely. She lay on the narrow cot, watching the firelight play across Xander's profile as he sat vigilant by the hearth, his revolver within easy reach. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was how strange it was that she felt safer in this precarious situation with him than she had in her uncle's grand house in Boston. Pearl woke to pale dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window. For a moment she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, looking for Xander. He was still in the chair by the fireplace, but his head had dropped forward onto his chest, his breathing deep and even. Despite his intention to keep watch, exhaustion and blood loss had eventually overcome even his formidable willpower. Pearl rose quietly, careful not to disturb him. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was chilly. She added wood from the stack and coaxed the flames back to life, then examined their supplies. Carson's shelves held jerky, dried beans, coffee, and hardtack, basic but sufficient. She was heating water for coffee when Xander stirred, instantly alert despite his exhaustion. "Good morning," Pearl said softly. "How is your arm?" He rolled his shoulder experimentally, wincing. "Still attached, that's something." "Let me check the bandage," she insisted, moving to his side. The wound looked angry but not infected. Pearl cleaned it again and applied fresh bandages, noting with concern that Xander's skin felt unnaturally warm. "You have a fever," she said, placing her palm against his forehead. "It'll pass," he dismissed. "We need to get moving. It's a few hours' walk back to town." Pearl frowned. "You're in no condition to travel that distance." "We can't stay here," he countered. "It's not safe, and people will be looking for us after we didn't return last night." Their debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Xander was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, positioning himself between Pearl and the door. "Get behind the table," he instructed in a low voice. Pearl complied, her heart racing as the hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin. There was a pause, then a knock on the door. "Carson, you in there?" "It's Sheriff Donovan." Xander exhaled in relief, lowering his weapon. "Sheriff, it's Xander Young." The door opened to reveal a weathered man in his 50s wearing a sheriff's badge. His eyebrows rose in surprise at the scene before him, Xander with his bandaged arm, Pearl emerging from behind the table. The signs of their overnight stay evident around the cabin. "Young, Miss Richardson, half the town's out looking for you two after your horse came back riderless last night." Quickly, they explained what had happened: the damaged wagon, the ambush, their flight to Carson's cabin. The sheriff's expression grew grave. "This matches what the Collins boy told me when they made it to town yesterday. Said men had been threatening his ma, telling her to clear out or worse." "The Collins family is safe in town?" Pearl asked, relief evident in her voice. "For now, they're staying at the church." The sheriff turned to Xander. "You need a doctor for that arm, son. I've got spare horses outside. Can you ride?" Xander nodded, though Pearl noted the tightness around his eyes that betrayed his pain. "I can ride." Within minutes, they were mounted and heading back toward Silver Creek, the sheriff leading the way with Pearl and Xander following. The morning sun illuminated the landscape, making the previous night's terrors seem distant and dreamlike. As they rode, Pearl found herself repeatedly glancing at Xander, concerned about his pallor and the slight sway in his posture. When he nearly slipped from the saddle after an hour of riding, she moved her horse alongside his and reached out to steady him. "We need to rest," she called to the sheriff. "He's burning with fever." Sheriff Donovan reined in and came back to assess Xander's condition. "You're right, Miss Richardson. There's a stream just ahead. We'll stop there." At the stream, they helped Xander dismount and settle against a tree trunk. Pearl soaked her handkerchief in the cool water and pressed it to his forehead while the sheriff checked his wound. "Bullet's gone clean through," Donovan observed. "But he's lost blood and there's infection starting. We need to get him to Doc Sullivan." "I'm fine," Xander insisted weakly, though his glazed eyes contradicted his words. Pearl exchanged a worried glance with the sheriff. "How much farther to town?" "About an hour at a gentle pace," Donovan replied. "But he won't stay in the saddle that long in this condition." After a brief discussion, they devised a plan. The sheriff would ride ahead to town to bring back a wagon and the doctor, while Pearl would stay with Xander and continue treating his fever with cool compresses from the stream. Once the sheriff had departed, Pearl focused entirely on making Xander comfortable. She propped him up with her satchel, kept his forehead cool with wet cloths, and coaxed him to drink water at regular intervals. As the fever took stronger hold, Xander began to drift in and out of lucidity. In his more coherent moments, he tried to maintain his stoic facade, but as hours passed, fragments of deeper thoughts escaped him. "Should have been more careful," he murmured at one point. "Put you in danger. Unforgivable." "Hush," Pearl soothed, wringing out a fresh compress. "You saved my life. You shielded me with your own body when those shots were fired." His feverish eyes found hers. "Would do it again. 100 times." The raw emotion in his voice made Pearl's breath catch. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Rest now. Help is coming." As he drifted again, Pearl reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just 1 week. She had come to Silver Creek seeking a fresh start, a place where her past couldn't find her. Instead, she'd found danger, yes, but also a community that valued her skills and a man who had risked his life to protect her. The sound of an approaching wagon roused her from her thoughts. Sheriff Donovan had returned with Dr. Sullivan, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and efficient movements. After a brief examination, the doctor administered laudanum for the pain and helped settle Xander in the wagon for the journey to town. "You did well caring for him, Miss Richardson," Dr. Sullivan told her as they traveled. "Your quick thinking likely prevented the infection from becoming more severe." "Will he recover fully?" she asked anxiously. The doctor nodded. "With proper care and rest, yes. The bullet didn't hit anything vital and he's a strong man." Back in Silver Creek, Xander was taken to the doctor's small infirmary behind his house, while Pearl found herself surrounded by concerned townspeople at the boarding house. Mrs. Whitaker fussed over her, insisting on a hot bath and a hearty meal, while the sheriff asked detailed questions about the ambush and their escape. It was past midnight before Pearl finally had a moment alone in her room. Exhaustion pulled at her, yet sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the danger they had faced and Xander's selfless protection. She wondered what he would remember of their conversations once the fever broke, and what it might mean for whatever was growing between them. For 3 days, Pearl divided her time between her teaching duties and visits to the infirmary. The town rallied around both her and Xander, with parents bringing food to the schoolhouse and ranch hands from the Rocking Y taking turns sitting with their foreman. On the 4th day, when Pearl arrived after school, she found Xander sitting up in bed, alert and clear-eyed for the first time since their ordeal. His face brightened visibly when she entered. "Miss Richardson," he greeted her, his voice stronger than she had expected. "The doctor says you're largely responsible for my continued existence in this world." Pearl felt a blush warm her cheeks as she took the chair beside his bed. "I merely applied basic care. Your own constitution did the real work. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." His green eyes held hers steadily. "I remember fragments of our time by the stream. Did I say anything I should apologize for?" "Nothing requiring apology," she assured him. "Only that you would shield me again if necessary." A smile touched his lips. Well, that was the truth at least. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Donovan, whose serious expression suggested this was more than a social call. "Young, Miss Richardson," He greeted them with a nod. "I've got news you'll want to hear." The sheriff proceeded to explain that based on the descriptions provided by Pearl, Xander, and the Collins family, he had organized a posse to investigate Blackwater Canyon. They had discovered a hidden camp used by a gang of rustlers and outlaws who had been terrorizing the region. "We captured 3 of them," Donovan continued. "They've been operating for months, stealing cattle and intimidating homesteaders to clear out valuable grazing land. The leader is a man named Harlan Mercer." "Mercer?" Pearl repeated, remembering her first night in town. "The man who accosted me on the street," the sheriff nodded grimly. "His brother, cut from the same rotten cloth. He's admitted to ordering the shots fired at you two, thinking you were gathering evidence against them, which, as it happens, you were, even if unknowingly. Have they been charged?" Xander asked, sitting straighter despite his injury. "They'll stand trial next month when the circuit judge comes through," Donovan confirmed. "Between your testimonies and the evidence we found at their camp, they're looking at substantial prison time." The news brought a sense of closure to their ordeal, though Pearl couldn't help but think of how differently things might have ended if Xander hadn't been with her that day. As the sheriff departed, a comfortable silence settled between Pearl and Xander. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun gilded the town in warm light, the mountains beyond standing as steadfast sentinels. "Dr. Sullivan says I can return to light duties next week," Xander said eventually, "though no riding for at least another fortnight." "That seems wise," Pearl agreed. "Your body needs time to heal properly." He hesitated, then added, "I find myself with unexpected free time in the evenings. I thought perhaps, that is, if you were amenable, I might call on you at the boarding house, properly this time without ambushes or medical emergencies." The formal phrasing made Pearl smile. This man who had faced down armed outlaws and endured a bullet wound with stoic resilience was nervous about asking to court her. "I would like that very much," she replied softly. His answering smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of pain and worry that had marked it since the attack. "Then I shall look forward to it, Miss Richardson." "Pearl," she corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think formality seems rather unnecessary between us." "Pearl," he repeated, her name sounding like something precious when he spoke it. "And I'm Xander to you always." The days that followed established a new pattern in Pearl's life. She taught during the day, finding deep satisfaction in the progress her students were making. In the evenings, 3 times a week, Xander would call at the boarding house, and they would sit on the front porch under Mrs. Whittaker's distant but vigilant eye, or take short walks through town when his strength permitted. Their conversations ranged widely from books they had both read to their differing experiences of the war, from the challenges facing the territory to their hopes for its future. Pearl found herself sharing more of her past than she had intended, including the real reason she had left Boston, her uncle's attempts to force her into marriage with a business associate 30 years her senior. "He had no legal right," she explained one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the boarding house porch. "My father left me a modest inheritance that provides independence, but after my mother died last winter, my uncle became insistent. He controlled my teaching position, my social circles. When I refused the match, he made life increasingly difficult." Xander's jaw tightened with suppressed anger on her behalf. "So you answered the advertisement for a position as far from Boston as you could find," Pearl nodded. "I needed to disappear, to go somewhere he wouldn't think to look for his proper, sheltered niece. The Wild West," Xander said with a hint of irony, "where you promptly found yourself in more danger than Boston could ever offer." "Yes, but also more freedom," she countered. "Here, I'm judged by my abilities, not my family connections or my willingness to make an advantageous match." His expression softened. "You've certainly proven your abilities. The children adore you, and the parents sing your praises at every town meeting." Pearl felt warmed by his words, but also curious about his own past, which he had shared in fragments but never fully. "What about you? What drove Xander Young west after the war?" A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment Pearl thought he might deflect the question as he had before. Instead, he took a deep breath and met her eyes directly. "I killed a man," he said simply. Not in battle, but after. He deserved it. He was trying to rob a widow I was escorting home, but his family was influential. They wanted me hanged, war hero or not. Pearl absorbed this revelation without the shock or horror he might have expected. So you left rather than face an unjust prosecution. The local sheriff, a decent man who'd lost his own son in the war, gave me a night's head start, Xander confirmed. I rode west and didn't stop until the mountains stood between me and my past. He studied her face carefully. Does that change your opinion of me? Pearl considered the question seriously. You've shown me who you are through your actions, Xander. You protect those who need protection. You stand against injustice even at risk to yourself. The circumstances that brought you here may have been regrettable, but I cannot regret that they did. The tension in his shoulders eased visibly at her words. I've never told anyone else the full truth. Not even Mr. Yates knows why I drifted into his ranch looking for work 4 years ago. Thank you for trusting me, Pearl said softly, moved by his confidence. His hand found hers on the porch railing, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I trust you with more than just my secrets, Pearl. The implications of those words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. Pearl felt her heart quicken, aware that they stood at the threshold of something deeper than friendship or casual courtship. Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Whitaker calling from inside that it was getting late, her tone suggesting that propriety demanded they end their evening. Xander reluctantly released Pearl's hand, but his eyes held hers with unmistakable meaning. Until tomorrow, he said, his voice low. Until tomorrow, she echoed. As autumn deepened toward winter, their relationship grew alongside the community's recovery from the outlaws' threat. The Mercer gang members were tried and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, bringing a sense of security back to the region. Families who had been intimidated into leaving returned to their homesteads, including the Collins family, whose children now attended Pearl's school regularly. Xander's arm healed completely, allowing him to resume his full duties at the Rocking Y, though he arranged his work to ensure he could still spend evenings with Pearl. Their courtship became a fixture of town life, noted with approving smiles by most residents who had witnessed their shared ordeal. On a crisp December evening, with the first snow of the season dusting the mountains, Xander invited Pearl to dinner at the small hotel that served as Silver Creek's only restaurant. He seemed unusually nervous, adjusting his collar repeatedly and checking his pocket when he thought she wasn't looking. The meal was the finest the hotel could offer: venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. They talked easily throughout, though Pearl noticed Xander's attention occasionally drifting, as if he were gathering courage for something. After dinner, he suggested a walk to see the town's Christmas preparations. The main street had been decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and lanterns hung from the storefronts, casting a warm glow on the light snow that had begun to fall. They paused near the schoolhouse, which looked particularly charming with candles glowing in its windows, placed there by Pearl's students for the upcoming Christmas pageant. It's beautiful, Pearl said, watching snowflakes catch the light as they drifted down. Yes, it is, Xander agreed, though his eyes were fixed on her face rather than the scene around them. Pearl, there's something I've been wanting to say. Her heart skipped at his serious tone. Yes, he took both her hands in his expression earnest in the golden lamplight. These past months have been the happiest of my life. When I came west, I was running from my past. I never expected to find a future worth staying for. Pearl's breath caught as he continued, his voice deepening with emotion. I know I'm just a ranch foreman with a complicated history. I can't offer the kind of life you might have had in Boston, but I can promise to love you, protect you, and build a life with you for as long as I draw breath. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest pearl set in its center. Pearl Richardson, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Joy welled up in Pearl's chest, bright and overwhelming. This man who had literally taken a bullet for her was offering his heart, his future, his name. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, Xander Young, I will marry you. His face transformed with happiness as he slipped the ring onto her finger, It fit perfectly, the pearl catching the lamplight just as snowflakes caught in Pearl's hair. "I love you," he whispered, drawing her close. "And I love you," she replied, the words feeling like coming home. Their kiss, tender and full of promise, was witnessed only by the gently falling snow and the distant mountains that had brought them together. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve in the town's small church, decorated with evergreens and candles for the holiday. Nearly everyone in Silver Creek attended, along with Mr. Yates and the ranch hands from the Rocking Y. Sheriff Donovan stood as Xander's best man, while Mrs. Wilson, whose twins had become Pearl's star pupils, attended as her matron of honor. Pearl wore a dress of deep blue velvet, a gift from her students' parents, with her mother's lace collar, and the pearl earrings Xander had surprised her with that morning. As she walked down the aisle toward him, his face alight with love and pride, she knew with absolute certainty that her journey west had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The minister spoke of commitment and partnership, of weathering life's storms together. When he reached the part about for better or worse, in sickness and in health, Pearl and Xander shared a knowing look, having already tested those vows during their ordeal months earlier. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister concluded with a broad smile. "You may kiss your bride." Xander drew Pearl into his arms with reverent tenderness, his kiss a promise of all the years to come. The church erupted in cheers and applause, the community celebrating not just a marriage but the triumph of love over violence, of hope over fear. The reception was held in the schoolhouse, transformed by the townspeople into a festive hall with tables laden with food contributed by every family. There was dancing to fiddle music, heartfelt toasts, and more genuine goodwill than Pearl had ever experienced at the formal Boston gatherings of her past. Late in the evening, as the celebration continued around them, Xander led Pearl outside to where a sleigh waited, decorated with ribbons and bells, a wedding gift from Mr. Yates. "Where are we going?" Pearl asked, laughing as Xander helped her into the sleigh and tucked blankets around them both. "Home," he answered, a new depth to the word as he took the reins. "Mr. Yates had a cabin built for us on the northeast corner of the ranch property. It's close enough to town for your teaching, but on ranch land so I can fulfill my duties as foreman." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise. "A home of our own, already," Xander nodded, his expression a mix of pride and slightly bashful pleasure. "The whole town helped. They've been working on it in secret for weeks. It's not grand, but it's solid and warm, with bookshelves for your collection and enough land for a garden come spring." Tears of happiness pricked at Pearl's eyes as she leaned against her husband's shoulder. "It sounds perfect." They drove through the snowy night, the sleigh bells jingling merrily, until they crested a small rise. Below them, nestled among pine trees, stood a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney and golden light spilling from its windows. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," Xander said softly. Pearl's heart filled with emotion as she took in the sight of their first home together. "It's beautiful." Inside, they found the cabin had been prepared for their arrival with a fire burning in the hearth, fresh evergreen boughs decorating the mantel, and a small Christmas tree in the corner. The furniture was simple, but well-crafted: a table with 4 chairs, a comfortable settee before the fire, a rocking chair, and through an open door, a bedroom with a large bed covered with a handmade quilt. "The women of the town made the quilt as a wedding gift," Xander explained, touching the colorful patchwork. Each family contributed a square. Pearl recognized patterns from fabric she'd seen in her students clothing a piece of Sarah Wilson's Sunday dress, material from Mrs. Collins's apron, a scrap from the shirt Carson the hermit had worn when he'd returned to find they'd borrowed his cabin. "It's our story," she realized, tracing the stitches with her fingertips. "All these people who have become part of our lives." Xander drew her into his arms, his expression tender in the firelight. "And now we begin the next chapter together." Spring brought new beginnings to Silver Creek and to the Young household. The mountain snows melted, feeding crystal-clear streams and carpeting meadows with wildflowers. Pearl continued teaching, her students thriving under her guidance, while Xander's position at the Rocking Y expanded to include part ownership when Mr. Yates decided to semi-retire. Their cabin became known for its hospitality, with regular Sunday dinners for friends and neighbors. Pearl started a book lending program from their growing library, and Xander began teaching riding and shooting skills to older students who wanted to learn. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Pearl turned to her husband with news she'd been waiting for the right moment to share. "Xander," she began, a special warmth in her voice, "I visited Dr. Sullivan today." He turned to her, instantly concerned. "Are you unwell?" Pearl smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "Quite the opposite. We're going to have a baby come winter." The wonder that transformed Xander's face was something Pearl knew she would remember all her days. Joy, awe, and fierce protectiveness all mingled in his expression as he gathered her into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." "Yes," Pearl confirmed, her own happiness bubbling up like a spring. "Dr. Sullivan says all appears well. The baby should arrive around Christmas a year after our wedding." Xander pressed his lips to her forehead, her cheeks, finally capturing her mouth in a kiss that conveyed all the love words couldn't express. When they parted, he kept her close, his hand still resting protectively over their unborn child. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed quietly. "A home, a wife I adore, a child on the way. After the war, I thought my life would always be about running from the past." Pearl leaned into his embrace, understanding completely. "And I never thought I'd find freedom and love so far from everything I knew, yet here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, his voice filled with contentment. As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, planning and dreaming for their expanding family. The mountains stood sentinel in the distance, solid and reassuring, while closer at hand, the lights of Silver Creek began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, the community that had become their extended family. In the years that followed, the Young family flourished alongside Silver Creek itself. Their son, James Carson Young, was born on Christmas morning, as predicted, followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Hope Elizabeth. The children grew up surrounded by love, learning both their mother's scholarly knowledge and their father's practical skills. Pearl eventually opened a proper library for the town. Funded partly by a successful cattle drive, Xander led that established the Rocking Y as one of the territory's premier ranches. Their home expanded along with their family, adding rooms and a larger garden where Pearl grew both vegetables and the flowers she'd missed from the east. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the children were asleep, Pearl and Xander would sit together on their porch and recall the night that had first brought them together: a frightened young woman, a protective cowboy, and a gunshot in the darkness that could have ended everything but instead had begun their story. "Do you ever regret it?" Pearl asked once as they watched a meteor shower streak across the vast western sky. Coming west, leaving everything behind, Xander's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Not for a moment. Everything that matters is right here." And as they sat surrounded by the life they'd built together, Pearl knew that the true adventure hadn't been the journey west, or even the dangers they'd faced. It had been finding each other, creating a family, and building a home where love flourished, a love born in danger but destined to last a lifetime.